Hi, it's James here. I just wanted to show everyone some things I've been working on recently. I've got two different procedural generated materials here. One is for kind of a metal, one is for kind of a fur. So I'll start by talking about the metal. I'm using PBR techniques in Substance Designer. If you don't know what PBR texturing is, Google it. It's mildly interesting. I'll dive right into how this works. Substance Designer is a node-based designer for texture generation. So there's a lot of really cool stuff that it comes with. All these different nodes are plugged together, and this actually generates the material. There's really just three different channels to the material that I really care about. There's the base color, the normal, and the roughness. The metallic is just because this is a metal. Metallic is always just a solid color, so I don't have like pieces of plastic embedded in my metal, so there's no point in keeping that anything different from just solid white. So I'm going to talk about how I was actually able to build this procedural texture with a slight caveat. Metal is extremely easy to do in Substance Designer, so this is kind of a little bit beginner level. We'll start at the top with the rust layer, where I'm taking an out-of-the-box. This comes with Substance Designer. There's a lot of these that I use that I think most people probably use, called the black and white spots. It's just a grunge map of it's got some really nice depth to it. It's basically a cloud noise generator, but it has a lot of different layers of detail. So you have this kind of like large scale light and dark areas, and then if you zoom in, you have these really nice little details inside of it too. And if you scroll in, it doesn't look too pixelated-y. You don't see any sharp edges. So the built-in ones in Substance Designer are really good. There's really no point in reinventing the wheel. So I turn this into Rust, and so I feed that into a gradient map, which goes from kind of my base color, my base albedo color, which is just a base color. Albedo is just a fancy word for color. And it takes all of the dark regions of this map here and converts them to the gray color, which is what my steel base color is. And it fades that all the way to kind of a rusty orange color. So it turns a black and white image into a color map. And what I want to be able to do with this is I want to control how much rust is on my material. So using procedural generation, if you just get one texture as a result, then it's still useful for that reason, but it's nice to have these little parameters that you can configure. So right now I have it set to 0.5, so I've got about 50% rust here. But if I scale this up, you'll see that the rust gets a lot darker. So this is as much rusted as you can get with this particular material. You can see that there's still some metallic bits in there. It's not fully covered in rust. That would probably, if I wanted something that was entirely rust, I would make a different material for that. But this is about as rusty as it can get for now. I'll scale that back down to 50%. So that's what this blend does. This blend has an opacity that is set to my rust amount. It's between 0 and 1. And I'm basically just blending it with this uniform color here. So this is my base steel color. And this allows me to blend this gradient map together. And so it's about 50% right now. I'm also using this for something else as well, which I'll get to here in a second. So moving on to the scratches. The scratches, I'm using two different scratches generators. One is with a larger size of scratches, and another one is with a smaller size of scratches. Again, this is just kind of like built-in functionality in Substance Designer. I'm blending the two together to make this scratches map. I'm putting a gradient map on it, and really all this does is it makes the because right here the edges are very hard, and I didn't want them to be that hard, so I'm using this gradient map at a very dark gray to kind of mellow them out. I could have used levels or something else for it, but gradient maps are just super easy to use. And then I'm blending the two together. So I take the rust channel and I'm blending it with the scratches channel. I don't want them to be too dark. And I'm using subtract mode, by the way. So even though this is, so it's going to take the whiteness from here and it's going to subtract that from this. So that's how it ends up turning dark. So anything in this that's black doesn't affect the texture here. So because I'm subtracting it. So it makes those spots darker, and that's just to kind of emulate the fact that, you know, if you get a scratch in metal, it's probably going to accumulate some dirt. So this kind of gives it the grungy look of, you know, maybe there's dirt in those scratches. So that's kind of what it's doing. But you don't want too much of this, so it's very subtle. I'm using the same scratches from up here. Or the same rust map, sorry, from up here, and I'm blending that with the scratches from here for something, and I'm keeping this chain going. Basically, at the end of the day, this becomes the roughness map. So roughness just means roughness is kind of the inverse of reflectiveness. You can think of it that way. You can have something that's metallic, but it's very rough, so it's not highly reflective. You could have everything from, like, you can imagine a piece of iron ore, which would have a roughness of 1 or 100%, all the way to a mirror, which would have a roughness of 0. So 0 would be, in this case, black, and 1 would be, in this case, white. So the scratches are very rough, they're not reflective, and there's some areas where if you have rust in a spot, then that will be a brighter white than if you don't have rust, it would be darker. So the brighter the color here is, the less reflective it is, the darker it is, the more reflective it is. So it's kind of like a reflectance map. So that's eventually what that ends up getting used for. We had the channel from the rust that was being used, and it's being blended with now the channel from the scratches. So that's how the rust and scratches work. Then we go to pitting. So this is one thing that you see very commonly, especially for anything that's old or has water damage on it. And you know, maybe it had water damage at one point, but then someone polished it or cleaned it. It's going to have some pitting. It's something you see in like cast iron skillets and, you know, basically anything old that's made out of metal. You'll eventually get some kind of pitting, knives, that kind of thing. So it's nice to at least have the capability. I might turn it off in real life or turn it down, you know, very small when I'm actually using this material. But it's nice to have it. So I start with these Gaussian spots. I'm never good at pronouncing these fancy old people words. So I start with these Gaussian spots, and it looks good. I mean, this is pretty much exactly what I wanted. You can see it has these little spots. These look just like pits to me. I could have probably generated something on my own, but again, there's a lot of really great built-in stuff to Substance Designer, so, you know, it's always good to use something that's existing if you want. But I didn't want it to be uniform, because if you ever look at a piece of metal that has pitting, it normally has certain areas are more pitted than others. So I'm taking this Perlin noise here and I'm multiplying the two together so that I get these dark areas and these kind of starry-like areas. So it kind of has a galaxy kind of look to it. And then using a gradient map on that, not really sure why, because it looks like both of these things are exactly the same, but maybe I was just playing around with it. And then blending that with the gradient map from the scratches. And that gets eventually used for the normal map. I'll talk about that here in a second. But what we're interested right now is in how it affects the actual color. So if we look at the color before the pits, again, it's a very subtle effect because the pits are gonna, kind of accumulate dirt. You can imagine it that way. So at the scratches level, you're only seeing the scratches, and then if we add the pits to it, it's a very subtle effect. I didn't want to go overboard with this, so I kept that one very subtle. And then if we take the roughness map, and we look at how that is being applied, you're basically taking these two things and you're multiplying them together. So now we're getting the pits as part of our roughness map. So the pits are going to be more rough. So you're going to see the little dots as being brighter than the backdrop because they are rough. Now to talk about the normal. So if you already know PBR, then you already know what the normal map is. But basically, the normal map is the thing that actually gives depth to the material. So the easiest way to describe this is to show you what it looks like without the right normal map applied to it. So if I just give it a base normal, there's no depth to it. It looks like a flat piece of metal. The scratches don't actually look like they're embedded in the metal. The pits, you don't even see the pitting at all. And the rust doesn't really matter one way or another because there's really no normal being applied to the rust. That's more of a roughness map kind of thing. But it just looks so much better if you have the normal map on it. It really gives it that depth. The normal map is kind of a hack that we use in video game texturing. Read up about it if you're interested. It's kind of out of scope of this video. So we've got our normal map applied. The way that you build a normal map in Substance Designer is you start by building a height map where black is the lowest point and where white is the highest point. So the interesting thing about that is it's kind of in this case, because I'm building I'm putting on layers that are actually embedded in the metal. I'm actually starting the other way around and then inverting it. So after it's inverted, here's what it looks like. You can see that the white areas indicate high values. So these are things that are all the way on top on the surface. And my scratches and my pits and anything else I wanted to kind of add to this in terms of damage would actually be embedded into it. So those would be darker values. The last step is to invert them. But before that, I have kind of a map of, where the white values indicate damage. And then I'm going to kind of subtract those out of my surface at the end. So this is pretty straightforward. Like I said before, the rust doesn't really tie into the normal mapping at all. It could. There's no reason why, I couldn't do it. But just the way that I built the material, I felt like it wasn't necessary to add any actual depth to the rust. It just kind of sits on the surface flatly. But the scratches definitely do. So I take these scratches and I merge it with the pits, and I get this map here. And then invert it, and then convert it to a normal map. This is what a normal map looks like. It's actually using the red, green, and blue channels as data. So what we're looking at here is not an actual texture. It's actually non-color data, or just computer data, but it just happens to look like a texture. And then of course the roughness, and metallic is solid white. So that's how you build this. I do have different parameters for different things. So like I showed you with the rust, I also have the ability to scale the large scratches, the ability to scale the small scratches, so I can increase the small scratches or decrease. Also the pitting, I have some control over that. Some very deep pitting versus hardly any pitting at all, or none. A lot of range in between. And the base color of the metal, which if I wanted to get fancy with this, I could make it kind of a, I don't know, I really don't know how I would make this look like a, but anyway, I have some control over the base color, and I don't think I'm really ever going to use this because it just kind of makes it look funky. Maybe if I was going to come up with like a mithril material or something like that, I might use it for something, but I don't know, it just doesn't look natural if I try to use it. So I don't know if I'll ever end up using it for anything, but it's a neat feature. The next material that I'm going to talk about that I think is pretty neat is this fur texture that I made. I was doing a lot of searching on the internet to try to find some good fur textures, and I did find some, but I figured I would give it a crack and see if I can make something that kind of resembles fur. I'm still not super happy with it, and I'm open to some criticism if anyone knows of a way that it could be improved. But I think it looks good enough, and I think in the finished product it looks okay. But it does kind of, I don't know, there's some kind of plasticky kind of fakeness that just kind of, I don't know, throws me off a little bit. But anyway, nonetheless, I'll show you how I made it. It's actually a lot simpler than I thought it would be. It's actually a very simple graph. It's probably even simpler than the metal one, and metal's supposed to be like the easiest thing ever. So I'll show you a little bit how I did this. And really the only reason why I was even able to build this is in the new version of Substance Designer, they added some really cool features. So one of the features that they added that's really cool is this SVG feature, where you have the ability to actually design an SVG object in the program. It's a little clunky, but this wasn't designed to be like a replacement for other programs that do vector graphics. This was just designed to like help you define a shape, and that's it. And that's all I needed. So really super useful for that reason. I'm really glad they added this feature. It's super cool. I actually don't know when they added it, so it might have been forever ago, and maybe I'm just behind the times. But anyway, so I'm starting with this shape, and I'm doing a grayscale conversion, and then I'm kind of blurring it along the edges just a little bit. I'm kind of trying to, because the edges are really hard at first, so I'm trying to do kind of like an anti-aliasing kind of thing here. It's a little bit intense. I probably could have turned down the intensity a little bit or used a better quality blur, because you can see the tip isn't quite as pointy as I'd like it to be. So there's some cleanup I could probably do there to make it look a little nicer. Then I'm doing a very intense blur on it, and then inverting it. So the reason why I'm doing this before I actually go through it is because I'm trying to get this kind of beveled look to it. So it kind of looks like it's popping out. So it has some depth to it. So what I'm really trying to do is I'm trying to take this shape and blur it, and then I'm inverting it here, because what I want to do is I want to take this mask and subtract it out of this thing. So if you can imagine taking the white part of this and subtracting it from that. And that's really where you get that bevel look to it. But one of the problems that I ran into when I did that is that it was subtracting too much from the tip, and I wanted the tip to stay kind of sharp. So in order to prevent it from subtracting out of the tip, I wanted to pull that tip down. So the way that I did that was I basically just took this gradient here and subtracted that from the mask so that it won't be subtracting so much from the tip. So that's what all that nonsense is doing there. So then what I wanted to do is that amount of beveling is okay, but this doesn't look very hair shape-ish to me. So what I did then is I kind of took again some more gradients here and subtracted that out. So now we've got something that's a little bit more shapely. And then another set of gradients here and subtracting more out of the top. So I kind of wanted it to have this, I kind of wanted it to blend in with the background the higher you get, the closer you get to the top. So it's supposed to just kind of like integrate into the mass of hair. So it kind of has this faded look towards the top. It's not so much a shape anymore. It's more of just kind of like a piece of something bigger. Then what I wanted to do is I wanted to have some kind of like strands of hair kind of thing. So if you look here, how it kind of has these little strands of hair going through here, I thought that was a really nice touch. So I added this anisotropic noise. Anisotropic is just kind of a fancy way of saying that something is smooth in one direction but not another. So it's smooth in the up and down direction, but it's not smooth on the left to right. And this gives me the kind of the effect that I'm looking for. It kind of gives me these banded lines going down, which turned out pretty well. So this by itself doesn't look super good. Just as a plain strand of hair. If I just had a whole bunch of these just pasted on the surface here, all pointing in the same direction and all that different stuff, it wouldn't look that good. So what I do then is the first thing I do is with the splatter plot. So you can see these are all very pointy. And hey, this is actually a pretty good start. I mean, you could almost just use this as your hair texture if you wanted it to look very uniform. You could probably just stop here and it might be okay. But one thing I really wanted was this kind of like waviness. I wanted to have this waviness of the strands of hair because I felt like that really added kind of an organic look to it. So that's what this directional warp does. And I'm taking some anisotropic noise again. This time it's smooth on the left to right, but it's not smooth up and down. And then I kind of blur it a little bit because if it was a little bit too hard like this, so I had to blur it. And then I applied that using a directional warp. So the directional warp is basically taking this and using it as a map to kind of nudge things to the left. Because you can see this arrow is pointing to the left. So it's just nudging everything over to the left based on anisotropic noise. It's actually pretty simple once you think about it. And that gives me that wavy look that I'm looking for. But it was a little bit still too regular for me. So I just wanted to apply some kind of grunge to it. It's kind of hard to tell the difference between these two things. And actually, I may have completely turned it down. It looks like, it's driven by a function is what it looks like. I'm not really sure what I did here. It doesn't appear to be doing anything. I thought I applied a grunge map to it, but I guess maybe I turned it off because it didn't look good. Okay, so next, so I guess we can talk about the normal map. We already talked about normal maps before. What we have at this point is going to directly be used as our normal map. So here's our normal map. It's kind of funny because it's using the DirectX format. It actually kind of looks like the normal map is is backwards. So it almost looks like it's kind of embedded, unless you can think of the light source as being at the bottom right, which is a little bit tricky, because I think by default your brain wants to think of the light sources coming from the top left, and I think that's what the OpenGL format does. But anyway, it doesn't matter. We still have our normal map. It still works. So now onto the color, or the albedo, fancy word for color. There's a reason for that use of terminology, but it's very nitpicky, and if you're interested, you can look it up on the internet. So here's what we're doing: taking the map here, applying a gradient map to it. This is how we colorize practically everything in Substance Designer, is using gradient maps. And you can see that the color is starting to come together. But it's still a little bit too, maybe cartoony is the word. It's very solid, not a whole lot of like actual like noise or graininess to it, which is what you'd kind of expect from real hair. So for that reason, I've applied this just white noise, put a gradient map to white noise, and blended those two together. So we have a little bit of graininess. It helps, but it's still, I'm still trying to think of better ways of doing this without really making it look funny. And then one thing I'm adding to it to give it that extra depth is the ambient occlusion. This is probably the most important part of the hair texture that really makes it look good, because without the ambient occlusion, it really would just look bad. And I'll show you what I mean. I made it so that the ambient occlusion level is configurable, so I can show you what happens when you turn off the ambient occlusion. Is it really just doesn't pop. You still have some dark areas, but when you, let me zoom in a little bit, when you turn that AO back up, it just really helps with the illusion of depth, because now these areas that are very highly raised have this dark outline around them, and it really helps if you compare the two before the AO and after the AO. It really helps with that illusion of depth. So super important. I try to use AO in pretty much any texture I use. I didn't use it in the metal because it didn't really need it, but in this case it's super important. So I made that configurable because I wanted to play around with it to see, if more doesn't always work better. We'll just put it that way. But I think this is a pretty good balance. So that just feeds directly into my color. Everything else is hard-coded. This thing really just has color and normal. If I wanted to adjust the roughness of it, I can always do that later on. For some reason, I followed a specular glossiness model when I did this. The other one I used a metallic shader. Not really sure why I did that. I really like using the metal shader for everything, even things that aren't metal. It just seems to look a lot nicer, because like this one, for example, I've turned the specular to solid black and the glossiness to solid black, and yet it still seems to have some glossiness to it, and I'm not really sure why. So I'm not sure if I'm really liking the whole specular workflow if I can't actually get rid of specular on something. But now the Fresnel effect I get, but I don't know. Anyway, now I'm rambling. So that's how I did that. I can show you some of the other features that I've added to this one. The hair quantity. This is kind of a funny one to play with. Do I even have this one hooked up? I don't think it's hooked up to anything. Huh. Okay. Well, maybe I didn't hook that one up. Hair opacity. So this allows me to maybe fill in areas that don't have that aren't supposed to have a lot of hair on them, or if I wanted to, it could be useful. Use your imagination. Okay, hair zoom. This is one that I really hope yeah. Okay, so this one's really cool because it allows you to um, kind of zoom in and zoom out so that you can get these really kind of fine, small little hairs, or you can get kind of these. It doesn't really look that great here, but actually, if I turned up the normal really high, then this would work. And that's something that you can configure at a shader level, but not you don't necessarily have to configure that here. So anyway, if you don't understand that, that's fine. But you can do this kind of stuff with it and get kind of like this really kind of fine, fuzzy kind of hair. This was one of the main features that I really wanted when I built this shader. Is I wanted this kind of like fine tuning kind of detail. This is the main thing that I wanted out of it, that you wouldn't be able to get that if you had just gone on the internet and just downloaded, a set of textures. You could always, scale the texture up and down, but it's not always that simple. So this makes it simple. So the hair zoom is a big one, and then of course the AO level we already talked about. You can always turn that down. One of the reasons why you might want to turn the AO level down is if your hair zoom was up a little bit higher. So if you have like a really fine hair detail, then you may not want to have a lot of AO. So that's one reason where you might use it. But most of the time, I would keep that turned all the way up. So before I conclude this video, I do want to show you kind of an applied example of the metal textures and the fur textures that I showed you previously. This is using an additional procedural texture that I created for leather. So I kind of have like a white leather here and a kind of a darker brown leather here. But this was actually a tutorial video that I found on the internet, and I basically followed it verbatim. So no point reinventing the wheel. I'll try to find that link to that video and put it in the comment, or I'll put it in the description. So hopefully I'll be able to find that video again. It was actually really awesome. So here's an example of the metal texture being applied to, say, a shoulder plate. You can see that shoulder plate already has a normal map tied to it, but I've basically just applied the map for the normal map for the actual metal is applied over top of it, so you can still see the pitting, you can still see the scratches. They just kind of blend together very nicely. One of the great features of Substance Painter. You can see some pixelization here in my baked normal map. I just really didn't want to make the texture resolutions too high, so I figured, this is probably good enough, so I just left it that way. You can see that the fur is kind of working, but this is designed to be more of a subtle kind of hair effect. If I really wanted to give this guy hair, I would have to actually do some custom geometry on it to actually give him like real looking hair. But this would just kind of be like the base layer of kind of fur that you would kind of put at, other places on his body, like his arms have kind of this fur kind of texture to them. So it's more for like a base layer, something that's matted to the surface. And it's not really supposed to be something that kind of sticks out and looks like real hair. So that's really what that texture was designed for. And you can see that the metal's applied to, multiple different areas here. I've got it applied to this kind of belt buckle looking thing, to his leg armor here. Looks fairly convincing. It's got some scratches on it, so it kind of looks like he's got some wear and tear. I think I turned the large scratches off completely and just kept the small scratches on it because the large scratches were just like way too big. And I think it looks a lot better this way. So, one of the advantages of building your materials configurable from, the start, as opposed to figuring it out later on down the line and then have to regenerate all your textures all over again because it turns out your scratches were too big. So it's really nice to have that capability. So yeah, this is what it looks like applied to a character. I did do some custom roughness tweaks along the way. So like for example, this this let me show you. The hair was a little bit too shiny at first, so I did have to turn up the roughness on that a little bit to make it so it wasn't quite so shiny. So that's one thing. But yeah, otherwise, that's what it ends up looking like at the end. So that's it. I hope it was helpful. I want to start making more videos like this in the future. So if you like it, definitely let me know. And, happy texturing.